Status Quo became part of my life probably about 1972. I think I've probably heard things like Pictures of Matchstick Men and not realised it was them. And I think the first time I ever heard Quo and thought, oh, this is all right, was Mean Girl, which might have been out in 1970, but I don't know when I heard it. I mean, it's a long time ago. So Mean Girl was probably the first song that I recognised and remembered as a Status Quo song.
What about, say, for instance, them as actually as this Denny Me Better? They don't seem to ever have been trendy, and yet they've always been still there.
I think with every band that becomes successful, there's the glory years, there's the momentum, if you like, where you can do nothing wrong. It doesn't matter what you wear. It actually also doesn't really matter what you do. If the fans love you, everything's forgiven. And this period can be anything from 18 months to 18 years, depending on who you are. I think with Quo, there was this period, like say from 72 to 74, where they could really do no wrong with whatever they put out. They had cool album covers, like the Quo album, which I think might have been the guy that did all the Yes stuff. What's his name? I'll answer that one again. What's his name?
I can't think actually what they got.
He did Ossie Bisa, and he did Yes, and he did Budgie. Anyway, it's that kind of cloud stuff. Yeah. But anyway, I'll answer that one again. Where's my pickup line? Yeah. Every band has this. Maybe it can be anything from 18 months to 18 years, where it's their momentum period, and nothing they do is wrong. Everything they do it's just like a snowball. It builds its own momentum going down a hill, and it just keeps going, and it's like a big juggernaut. And between 72 and 74, they had it down. I mean, from after Mean Girl, I think you in no particular order, because I wouldn't remember. You've got Roll Over, Lay Down, Caroline, and even the great stuff off Pile Driver, things like 4,500 Times, and there was there's so many. I mean, off the top of my head, you run out of superlatives for that period of time, because they were a little bit in a sense like Leppard were in the 80s, the kind of sore thumb of the 70s. If you look at a chart and see where a Quo single is, it's likely to be sandwiched in between Perry Como and some horrible disco act or some crappy pop band that won the Eurovision or something. They'd be this token rock band that were doing it for us by infiltrating the pop charts, and it didn't happen very often. You'd get Radar Love, so that you get one song from Golden Earring, and you'd get two hits from Argent, and you'd have half a dozen hits by Mott the Hoople, but you'd have these, like, just every time they put a single out, Quo were in the charts, and they didn't appear to make any kind of an effort to, like, oh, let's go to the King's Road and buy some stuff. It's like, no, we wear denim and that's what we do. Which would have probably, got this kind of reaction from Brian Ferry or David Bowie. But the Strange Bedfellows success makes, because I know for a fact that, at least Parfit, Rick's pretty tight with like Roger and Brian from Queen, who you'd think, they'd be a bit standoffish and a bit uppity about something like Quo, but not at all. So they absolutely did have their moments.
One thing people have had some things interesting to say about on this one is live albums. You guys, with what you do, will spend a long time in a studio perfecting, if you like, your Picasso. Mm. Then one night you go on stage, do your slapdash Roll Faris version of that same thing, and from that we get Lizzy Live and Dangerous, Kiss Alive 2, Frampton Comes Alive, Someone Remains the Same. Why do you think live albums are so important to fans?
Because they can pretend they were there if they weren't. Because they were there but at a different show. And it also, I honestly believe there's a subconscious connection between an audience and an artist that can't ever be achieved from just constantly listening to studio records. Now, studio records are extremely important because they are the bedrock of they're the foundation of your career, they're the foundation of your catalogue. But as a kind of a stepping out Friday night party part of the week, if you like, that's what your live album is. And a live album is like a celebration of what came before. Specifically back then, more so than now, live albums were actually, to the artist, a brilliant opportunity to re-record substandard studio songs. And I said this when I was asked about the Lizzy stuff. Live and Dangerous is such a great record because every song on there is a better sounding version of the studio versions. The stuff off Jailbreak and Johnny the Fox sound a little tinny. You hear them live, and they've got this massive amount of power because they don't. It doesn't get sucked out in the studio. A lot of bands in the 70s didn't make great sounding studio records, either through budget, not great producers, or just lack of time. With a live album, notoriously, you've been on the road for a year. You've got the songs down. When you did them in the studio, it might have only been the second, third, or fourth time you played it. So it's always got a bit of a stiffness. So please don't make a mistake. When you get it on stage and you're playing it for the 100th time, you couldn't make a mistake if you tried because you're into that robotic mode. You know, it's just eyes closed and heads down and off you go. So live albums, specifically from the 70s, were actually better versions of the studio albums. That's why they became important, and that's what set the trend with Live and Dangerous, with Frampton, the Kiss albums, a couple of others, you know, like UFO. You've got albums with better versions of the studio stuff, and then that kind of dissipated and disappeared in the 80s because studios came along with smaller gear, easier to operate, and better sounding stuff, and it just became the decade of nonsense, really, where people just went over the top with production. And only the good ones like Mutt and Trevor Horn really honed it down. You hear these big mad drum sounds that people were using in the 80s. They sound fantastic if Mutt does it. They sound great if Trevor Horn does it. Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Grace Jones and all that kind of stuff. Peter Gabriel did a good job. But a lot of the stuff that you hear on like some of these classic 80s stations, you hear the pop songs, not necessarily the rock songs. It's just overblown nonsense, which you couldn't possibly better live. In fact, half the time the production was so good is because the artists needed help. Whereas you see in the 70s, you couldn't get a record deal if you couldn't play. So Quo at least had that on their side, was they were actually a band. They could perform. They weren't necessarily the best musicians in the world, but that's what makes the best bands. Look at U2. Admittedly by their own, you know, they admit it themselves that individually they're not the hottest shot there is, but put them together collectively and they came up with a unique thing. Quo, same kind of thing. It's 12-bar boogie is what people call it. Francis Rossi sounds like he's singing with a peg on his nose. That is his character. And it's easy for Spitting Image to mimic that, but it's what made him successful. So we embrace that deficiency because fans, true fans, actually go, good for you. I wish I had the balls to do what you're doing because I may actually have the talent, but I just never got the breaks or I just don't have the balls to do what you're doing. And so you're doing it for me. And that's why I connect with you. And I've always been a fan of people that aren't the best singers. You know, I'm often bracketed wrongly, big time, by the media as like trying to be a Coverdale or a Rogers, and I'm not. I never was. I never wanted to be. My heroes were the ones that had deficiencies, like Gary Holton, Ian Hunter, Alex Harvey, people like this that were portraying a lyric, not necessarily singing with perfect vibrato and all that kind of stuff. Bolan and Bowie, great examples of pretty good singers, but not from that Otis Redding school where Rogers and Coverdale would come from. And Francis Rossi and Rick Parfitt were people that just developed a voice. They became instinctively recognisable, like Ozzy Osbourne. You can put Ozzy in front of Sabbath, you can put Ozzy in front of the London Philharmonic, and you'll go, that's Ozzy Osbourne. And you'll say exactly the same thing about Rick or Francis. Got their own style.